All right, welcome back to another episode of the Brothers-in-Law podcast. I am Imani, one of your humble hosts and your fellow brother-in-law.
Conrad.
I got my fellow brother-in-law and co-host here, and today we have a very special guest. We have Steve Zeidman here, Professor Zeidman here, and we're going to be having a conversation today about clemency and just the nature of clemency in that work in general. Before we dive into it, can we just do a brief check-in, see how we're doing? Conrad, how's your holidays? How are things going? How's work?
Holidays are going well. I still am dealing with a little bit of the aftermath of getting food poisoning right before Thanksgiving.
That's rough.
Don't think I'm 100% yet, but I'm there.
Yeah.
And I think I explained a little bit on another episode, but recently we, the city council and public defender's offices sued Mayor Adams over his failure to implement Local Law 42, which is a solitary confinement bill for the city.
Good work.
And so, that just dropped. So we're dealing with, the beginning stages of that lawsuit.
Gotcha. Steve, how are your holidays? How's work? How's life?
Holidays are, it's clemency season.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, the holiday kind of taking a little bit of a break begins January 2nd.
Okay.
Wow.
Because clemency, it's traditionally been, and this is part of the problem, but it's traditionally been this Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve, and governors sort of use it as this is a Christmas gift, an act of mercy. I mean, it's sick, but that's generally how it is. So, we're gearing up, expecting some announcements by the end of the year. So that means supplementing applications and banging that drum as hard as we can.
Gotcha. We'll dive a bit more into that in a second.
Sure.
I'm doing well myself. I had a really great Thanksgiving. My father lives in Kenya, and my fiance surprised me with getting him out here to come visit me.
Nice.
And I only get to see him once a year, maybe once every 2 years. And I was at her home on a Sunday, and she was like, Imani, I have a package outside. I need your help to bring it in.
That's beautiful.
And I walk outside, and there's my dad with 2 suitcases.
Fantastic.
So I got to spend Thanksgiving with him and the week after. So it was a great, great gift and a blessing.
I'm going to poke some fun at Imani. He was late feeding my cat. And so I'm texting him because my wife, she's on it. I didn't see anyone go in to feed Oswald yet. And it's we know, we had a schedule for our friends who graciously helped us. And it was Imani's day. And she was like, can you ask Imani if he fed Oswald yet? And so I'm texting Imani. He's like, no, I'm sorry. I haven't fed him yet. I just got surprised with my dad being here. I was like, okay, that is, I can't get mad at him
That's
for
a
that.
good one. That's a good one.
But things are going well.
Yeah, it's a tough one to beat. That's beautiful.
Right? Thank you. But let's get to it. For those who are tuning in for the very first time, the Brothers-in-Law podcast is a platform where we talk about really all things life and law related. Mm-hmm. It initially started off as a Know Your Rights podcast of educating people about, our rights and our powers, but it has since elevated into a platform to share stories about formerly incarcerated, people who are wrongfully incarcerated, people who have been impacted in other ways, or times for people to come in and talk about their expertise in certain areas of the law. So it's a pretty broad scape of things that we discuss here at the Brothers-in-Law podcast. Today, we want to talk about clemency. And I know for those of us who are lawyers, we are a bit more familiar with what it is, but your average person may not understand what clemency really means or how it actually plays out. So that's why you're here, Steve, to talk about clemency.
Do my best.
All right, so let's take it from the top. First of all, what do you do? And then we'll move on from there.
What I do, I teach at CUNY Law School.
Okay.
That's it's becoming more, I shouldn't say this, but it's becoming more and more the side hustle. Because the clemency work and trying to extricate people serving life and long-term sentences is really, but it's at the heart of what I teach as well in the clinic. So working with students to try and figure out ways to extricate people.
Okay.
So teach some traditional law school classes, but for the most part, it's devoting my time, the students' time, to figuring out how do you extricate someone who's, sentenced to perish in prison.
Got you. Before we get into the weeds of clemency, can you walk us through what your journey to clemency was? So you were initially a public defender in Manhattan,
in
right?
Manhattan, yeah. Yeah, I was a public defender in Manhattan. And when I think about the best public defenders that I know, the relationships, especially when a case goes to trial, the relationships that you develop with people, and even, and knowing, for example, the Bronx Defenders, the idea of holistic, to me, we were so focused on the moment in time. And holistic meant, okay, my client's facing criminal charges, but maybe they have eviction problems, maybe they have immigration problems, and that's all critical and crucial. But where holistic representation seemed to end is once my client was sentenced, especially if they were sentenced to state prison. It's like, well, maybe there'll be an appeal, maybe there won't. But we as public defenders, clueless about what's going on, about how does somebody prepare themselves for hopefully getting out? How do people thrive, manage to live when they may never get out, when they're doing 50 to life, 75 to life? And so for me, that was, and really stumbling upon, I have to admit, I call this post-conviction work. It just made me feel like there's this missing piece at the trial level public defense work that we just have to kind of focus on to kind of think about what does this plea mean for someone. You get 10 to 20. Do we think they're going home in 10 years?
Right.
How do we begin to talk to somebody? So anyway, it's sort of very circular for me. It kind of made me rethink what I was doing as a public defender, but stumbling upon Clemency, and that's a long story, which I'm sure we'll get into, it just kind of opened my eyes to this whole other missing piece of criminal defense work.
And did you go straight from being a public defender to working in Clemency, or what was that transition?
No, I was a public defender for almost a decade as a staff attorney. I was a supervising attorney here in Manhattan. Then I began to do clinical teaching. And by clinical teaching, most law schools across the country now, in your last year of law school, there's a clinical program, to get students out of the classroom and into the courtroom,
right?
Under supervision. So I did that for a number of years. And that is usually the traditional, let's work with students representing people in criminal court, facing misdemeanors, trying to inculcate good habits, trying to take from the students what they see is wrong, to educate you, as opposed to saying, this is what you do, saying, hey, what do you think? Are there better ways? And I did that for a number of years. And then the Clemency piece sort of came out of, I wish I could say I was thinking about it, that I had the foresight. I didn't. It just sort of came across my computer screen.
Wow. All right, let's get to it. What is Clemency?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. Because let me just start by saying, what is Clemency? In the news now, it's just crushing. Because the only time people hear about clemency is usually when it's something political. We're going to go after Biden for pardoning his son. We're going to go after Trump, saying, I'm going to pardon everybody who was involved in January 6th. I'm going to pardon my cronies. So clemency, there are two types of clemency. And to me, it may sound semantics, but it's crucial. Because when you beat up a governor and you say you haven't done any clemencies, and they'll say, what do you mean? I've done 200. And at first, when I was getting involved in this, I'm thinking, what am I missing? Well, that's because I finally learned clemency is an umbrella term. There's a pardon, there's a sentence commutation. And this is what I get to say. I'm going to put you both on the spot.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, so a pardon expunges the conviction, erases it, evaporates it. You can fill out a form where it says, have you ever been arrested? You could say, nope, it's gone. A sentence commutation, the conviction remains. Just reduces your time. So which do you think is more controversial?
Well, I've done a lot of
Pardoning.
reading in this, and I would say clemency.
Well, careful. Using the umbrella term.
I would say the commutation is.
Okay.
Because my argument would be that most people who get pardoned are already released, and commutation is what results in people's immediate release.
There you go. So the pardons, when I was dealing with Governor Cuomo's people, pushing them to push the governor, say, where are the clemencies? And they kept saying, he did 40, he did 50. What are you talking about? They were talking about pardons. So from a governor, from an elected official's perspective, at least, less controversial because you know what the typical one is? These are the typical ones in New York of the last 15 years. Someone has been out of prison, if they ever went to prison, for 15, 20 years and is facing immigration consequences, or they can't get a license because of a marijuana sale from 20 years ago. All right, I'll pardon that. What we're asking for with these commutations, everybody is in state prison. And we're saying this person's doing 50 to life. 2 people were killed 35 years ago. This is a very different person. Would you commute their sentence to the 35 years they've been in? From an elected official's position, that's New York Post headlines, right? Governor commutes sentence of, murderer. You can imagine what the press does with this. So it's a heavier lift.
Got you. So clemency is the big umbrella of pardons and commutations. And fair to say that your work is largely on the commutation side?
Almost exclusively on the commutation side, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Is there a reason you focus on commutations more than pardons, or is that just how things shake out? It's a little of both. The first case that I got involved with, there was if you are a criminal law professor in any way, shape, or form in New York, like probably everywhere, you get emails, letters all the time from people seeking help. This particular email, it was a blast to every criminal law professor in New York. It was from a solo practitioner. And it said, I've been representing this woman, a woman named Judy Clark, for 7 years. She's doing 75 to life. And I'm trying to figure out a way to get her out. She's got the support of so many people. But I need to move on. I'm a solo practitioner. I've done everything. If anyone is interested, send me an email. So I was very familiar. I remembered Judy Clark's case with Kathy Boudin, with Matula Shakur. I remembered the whole thing. And in my mind, it was like, wow, they're still in prison. Wow. That was so long ago. And at this point, it was almost 35 years ago. So I just responded to the email. I said, I am no expert in clemency. I did one case about 10 years before. But if no one else responds, I'm willing to bring in some students and give it a shot. And a few days later, I got an email basically saying, Tag, you're it. Nobody responded.
What year was this?
This was 2015.
Okay.
2015. So that got me started on the commutation piece.
Okay.
And, from a lawyer's perspective, this is where you just have to be, humble. There are so many mistakes along the way. As lawyers, someone comes to you and says, this person's doing 75 to life. They've been in for 35 years. Can you help? And my first thought was, this is that legal training, right? I'm going to file a motion in court.
Right.
Hey, judge, will you resentence this person who's done so well for 35 years, who has the support of the superintendent, so many peers inside, formerly, currently incarcerated people. I mean, so much support. And as I begin to do that, I figure, well, I've never done this before. I might have to check the statutes, and I start reading. New York does have a resentencing statute.
Yes.
So I say, okay, good to go.
Yes.
Except there's only one ground, that your original sentence was illegal. So it doesn't matter if at this point in time everyone thinks it's immoral, unnecessary, inhumane, indecent. The prosecutor supports it, the judge supports it, the victims, doesn't matter.
Right.
There's nothing you can do.
The law doesn't allow that to happen.
Doesn't allow it. So, and this is why, and I hope we get to it, this pending now with Bill in New York, the Second Look Act.
Yes.
Which is really just trying to add, in my view, 3 words to the existing statute: in the interest of justice. So you can move for resentencing in the interest of justice. Right now you can't.
I do work with Communities Not Cages, so
there
I'm
you
familiar with, and so does Judy, the space I'm in with her. So.
Got it. Yeah, it's critical. That would open things up. But once that door closed, then it was a matter of, okay, where can we go? And it was, clemency.
Yeah.
And that's this vast, in New York, this vast, unfettered, I have to come with more adjectives, it's vast, unfettered power the governor has.
Right.
It's right in the New York State Constitution. The governor doesn't need a task force, doesn't need legislative approval. There's no appeal. There are over 1,000 applications on Hochul's desk right now. She could grant clemency tomorrow. 10, 20, 50, 100 people. There's nothing anyone could do to stop it.
A lot of power.
It's total. The only thing you can't is treason and something else.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, the governor has vast power. So as I began to look at that for Judy Clark, the first thing everyone told me, lawyers, community organizers, advocates, people inside and outside, everyone said it's a waste of time because no one gets clemency. So then I looked, this was 2015, I just looked at the preceding 5 years. Anyone want to guess how many clemency grants there had been between?
Including both pardon and commutations?
Commutations, I'm sorry. I'm just focusing on commutations. From 2010 to 2015.
In New York or in
Just New York. I was trying to get a fix at that point on Andrew Cuomo, who was the governor.
Right.
Well, how frequently? Zero.
Wow. I was going to guess like 100.
Yeah, I was going to throw out a
commutations. So when people said you're wasting your time, my first thought was, well, that's okay. None. I guess he's not that interested in using the sentence commutation power. And then people kind of added on. They said, if you are going to pursue it, let's be very clear. You're never going to get clemency for someone convicted of a serious crime,
right?
A violent crime. And then the next step was, well, if you're still going to go ahead, no one is ever going to get clemency for a murder conviction. That's just never going to happen. But, there was no other option.
Right.
So that's what started it.
Yeah.
I brought in a couple of students. I met Judy. We spoke together. Her former lawyer, Sarah Bennett, had laid the groundwork, had done an incredible amount of work gathering support. And it was marshaling all this evidence, her, quote, institutional record inside, to present a clemency package to the governor and saying, just do the right thing, commute her sentence.
Yeah. Can you give a bit of background about what Judy's crime was and her story and
Sure.
her history?
Yeah, Judy's crime of conviction happened in 1981. This was an effort to an attempted robbery of a Brinks truck, which was pretty much orchestrated by members back then of the Black Liberation Army. Judy was a getaway driver. So she didn't fire any weapons. She didn't possess any weapons, but 2 police officers were killed and a Brinks guard was killed. And this was in Orange County, New York. A lot of press. And Judy and the others who were arrested, for them, this was a political statement. So at the time of the trial, that sort of approach to their prosecution continued, not recognizing the authority of the court, et cetera, et cetera. And Judy and others were sentenced to 75 years to life.
25 years for each.
25 years for each. And I know you both know this, but I think it's important for people to know because this is what I always say to the students when they're going home for Thanksgiving. I say, just do me a favor. When you're sitting around the table talking with people, they ask you what you do and you're interested in public defense and these issues come up, just educate them about what sentences mean, in particular in a state like New York. And they say, what do you mean? I say, well, because I've lost track years ago of how many people say, 50 to life, so what, they get out in 15 years? Oh, they got 25 flat, what do? 5? Well, there are some states where you can, really, you can earn time off.
Right.
Not
New York, we are a so-called truth in sentencing state. What a friend of mine refers to is we get federal blood money. So when you get 75 to life, when you see the parole board? 75 years. Get 25 to life, when do you see the parole board? 25 years. So it's somebody like, Judy, who's doing 75 to life. That's, in my view, that's a sanitized way of saying I sentence you to death in prison.
Yeah.
And so clemency becomes, at this moment in time in New York, the only option.
Yeah, mind you, to that point, New York is behind states like Oklahoma and Mississippi, Florida. And so
it's incredible.
Which is a reason why the Second Look Act is such an important piece of legislation.
So crucial. And on that Second Look Act, if I can, this is something that's also been kind of mind-blowing to me. This goes back to when I was first reading the resentencing statute, because I'd never looked at it before doing trial work. I hadn't done any post-conviction work. And I was thinking to myself, okay, wait a minute. As a public defender, and I know, you know this, I know judges don't grant these very much, but when someone's arrested, I can file a motion to dismiss in the interest of justice. That's a statute.
Right.
Yeah.
There's case law. And then when someone is convicted after trial and they're sentenced, you can appeal to the appellate division, that first level appeal, and ask them to reduce your sentence in the interest of justice. That's right there. So it's mind-blowing that 20, 30, 40 years later, when someone has so much evidence of who they've become,
Right.
there's no interest of justice provision to say, hey, would you re-examine my sentence? And to me, again, that's where the Second Look Act comes in. I know there's a lot of language in it, but it really, for me, it just boils down to the interest of justice.
Right.
Just give someone an opportunity to say, look at who I am. Look at what I've achieved. I take responsibility. I'm accountable. My remorse is genuine.
Yeah.
These are all the things I've done to try and atone and repair. Just give me an opportunity.
Yeah.
And if you judge, you think the sentence remains appropriate, so be it.
Yeah.
But right now, we don't even offer anybody that degree of hope.
Yeah. You know, something I struggle with is I find myself recently having a lot of conversation with people, trying to get them to rethink, you know, how we view punishment, how we view crime and things like that. And what I've realized is that I think the most powerful tool is getting people to really interact with people who have been impacted by the system, who have served these years, to like meet them and see the humanity inside these individuals. But that interaction is very hard. And what happens is all we really have is our words and our language to try to convince people. And what I'm realizing is that like being vengeful and retaliation is, in my opinion, a much more like innate human characteristic than mercy and forgiveness.
Indeed.
So I'm really struggling when it comes to like speaking to people who are your regular individual about encouraging them to be a bit more merciful and to be a bit more, forgiving and to extend grace. I think it's hard for me to do that in conversation. Indeed. Without them actually, stepping into the prisons and meeting someone who's been there for 40, 50 years and speaking and getting to see someone's transformation.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a challenge that I'm dealing with when I'm talking to people.
I mean, I was saying this in an earlier conversation. Like, in my mind, part of it is just like getting people to understand that the harms that they are committing when they are, and I say they, like judges and legislators who write these sentencing bills and implement the sentencing bills.
Yeah.
Like, you are placing a very similar amount of harm on the individual who is going to be sentenced as you are saying that this individual did to the person who was the victim of the crime. Yeah. And so, like, how does that make you any different than this person that you are about to sentence?
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And it becomes immutable, it becomes permanent.
Right.
Which is the part about it, to try and reach people, which is a challenge. I have talked to various legislators, in particular, not the ones who are already on board.
Yeah.
The more conservative ones, typically overgeneralized, but typically upstate, out on Long Island. And usually there's a group of us. And inevitably the question, comes up. You mean to tell me that if a loved one of yours was murdered? I said, and by the way, usually when we're there, some of the people can say, I've lost loved ones to violence.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
When I get that directed to me, what the best thing that I can come up with is I say, look, I'm blessed. I have never lost a loved one to that kind of violence. And I can't pretend that I'm not going to pretend that I would say, oh, I want, give them the minimum, be merciful. I hope I would. All I can say is, having met so many people inside, and really it's just kind of coming, I just hope that we can maintain space to recognize and value redemption. That's my hope. And the other part of it is, that vengeance, the retribution. Right. Here's the other thing I've learned from doing clemency work. It's the most challenging thing for the student, well, actually for everybody, is this can be 30 years. I mean, virtually everyone we work with was convicted of murder. So when I say the victim, we're dealing with the victim's family. Mm-hmm. Okay? This could be 30 years after the case, because those are the people who write to us. I've been incarcerated for 35 years. Judy, 35 years. David Gilbert, who was arrested with Judy, 40 years. We know the governor's people. They're going to reach out to the victims. We do it. They ask us to. The governor's people say, did you get anything? And I just think it's so, obviously we bring in restorative justice practitioners, defense-initiated victim outreach, the DEVO practitioners. But what comes to mind immediately is that when I say we, society, we offer the victim's family nothing. Mm. Oh, you can make a victim impact statement. And then, hey, I hope you get some therapy or something. Mm. So 30 years later, when we appear, or to have a legislature, how would you feel? It's like, well, you know what? You're asking the wrong question. It's really, what do we do for family members? How do we help people?
Yeah.
And right now, there is nothing offered to people except vengeance.
Right.
To say, okay, do you want to be heard at sentence? And I've now read, hundreds and hundreds of sentencing transcripts, and they break your heart.
Yeah.
That was my father, that was my partner, that was my son, and it's heartbreaking. And now it's 30 years later,
Right.
and nothing has been offered. No update, no. So I'll give you one concrete example.
Okay.
New York has something called the Apology Bank, which very few people inside even know exists.
I didn't know about it.
And it's so ironic because parole boards will often say to someone, have you submitted a letter to the Apology Bank? And people go, the what? Oh, you did? No, very few people even know it exists.
Mm-hmm.
For the longest time, the way the Apology Bank functioned was if you were in and you wrote a letter to the Apology Bank, the only way the family of the person who was killed would ever find out was if they happened to be registered with the Office of Victim Services, number one, and number two, if they just happened to reach out, I guess on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Hey, is there any letter in there for me?
Mm.
So it had built up what was the point of the Apology Bank?
Right.
The slight change they made now is if the victim's family has registered with the Office of Victim Services and a letter comes in, that office is supposed to notify the person, not send the letter, just say, hey, we got this. If you want to see it, we'll send it to you. But again, I have a feeling very few people are even registered.
Right.
So we rather than figuring out ways to bring people together, we just create barriers to make it almost impossible.
Right. I think that's a microcosm of the issue with the system in general. It's like we only give one option. When it comes to harms, we only give police. When it comes to accountability, we only give prisons. Like we don't have other alternatives.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I want to mention one other thing. When you talked about the bringing people in, one of the people that we worked with who got clemency, he talks about the word proximity all the time. He said, the more there's proximity, the more people come in, the more, the prisons are built to keep people, not only to keep us in, but to keep people out. And the more people come in, if you meet someone and you talk to someone, it just doesn't become, quote, like the Post headline, a murderer, it's a person. And so we have, there's a group of, I think it's 22 people now that came together and created something called the Clemency Collective.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all people who've received clemency in the last several years. And they are the best spokespeople for clemency.
Yeah.
I'll forward you a link if I can remember. There's a video that was just created. It's 12 minutes. It's called Clemency Collective Stories. You just hear from 5 people. There's nothing more powerful to make the case for clemency than hearing from these folks and getting a little window into what they're doing now.
Right. All right. I have a question. A lot of the people who are advocated for it to be given clemency are people who've served, 30, 40, many years in prison. And part of the argument is to show that they have been rehabilitated, they've been changed, they are not the person who they were when they entered incarceration. A fear that I have is that someone who engages in a dialogue with us may arrive at this idea that prisons work.
Yeah.
What we're saying is that, okay, after doing 30, 40, 50 years, all right, maybe then those people are the ones who are deserving of being released, and that it legitimizes, prisons. So do you think that there's any potential for people to misconstrue our advocacy for clemency to legitimizing prisons?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I remember when Judy Clark got clemency, Cuomo, who granted clemency, he said at one point, we call it the Department of Corrections. She's as corrected as anybody could be. And I appreciated it, but it sort of makes your point. When you speak to people inside, including the people who've got clemency, they said, look, I did the mandatory programming, but my transformation was from the programs we created inside for ourselves. The things that we leaned on each other for.
Right.
Part of what you're raising, I'll give you a concrete example. After Judy, the next person I worked with who got clemency was someone, it's sort of ironic. he was referred to me. A bunch of people reached out after Judy got clemency. I had written an op-ed or two. The only reason I mention that is that's what led to the explosion of requests for help.
Yeah.
It has never stopped. We got 878 requests for help in New York State alone last year. We're going to top 1,000 this year. This is from people serving life or long-term sentences. After Judy got clemency, a bunch of formerly incarcerated folks said, hey, there's this incredible guy, a mentor to so many of us. Anthony Dixon being one of the people who grabbed me one day and said, this guy named Roy Bolus. Roy's amazing. He's got 2 masters. He's about to become the first New York State prisoner to earn a PhD while incarcerated. You got to help him. And my being new to to thinking about clemency, I thought, well, wow, that's a great case for clemency. And when Roy's 3,000-page dissertation made its way to the governor's office, it got their attention. And he got clemency.
Wow.
But it was really, as I was working on Roy's case, that's when it really forced me to recognize this notion of exceptionalism. You know? Like, oh, if you can get 2 masters, maybe you're going to get clemency. And really what it does is it obscures the larger problem, which is the massive sentences. That's the problem. That's what clemency's trying to address, massive sentences. So I worry about this all the time. When we get these letters, inevitably people say, I've done this, I've done that, I've got this, I've got that. And you worry about the person who, not everybody's going to get 2 masters. You worry about the people inside serving these death by incarceration sentences who are just putting one foot in front of the other. They're not a threat to anybody after 20, 30, 40 years. But the organizations that come in, the advocacy groups, I've got to plead guilty. No one knows about them. You don't hear about them. A lot of folks don't have the wherewithal to even reach out and write a letter to someone. So the clemency work for me, we're trying to extricate people one person at a time. And I keep saying it's on the road to decarceration. You know, the fight about sentences, the second look bill, excessive sentences. I mean, that's the fight, right? How do we stop that? You know, and the way I think about it too is, while I'm going down that particular path, the reformers, the people who are thinking about change, and even the Second Look Act, these are all vital, right? People that I think it's fair to say there's a recognized crisis of mass incarceration.
Yeah.
Right.
For the most part, left and right. I think most people do.
Yeah.
The question is, what are we going to do about it? And so much of the suggested reforms are prospective. Get rid of 3 strikes and you're out, rethink drug crimes, rethink enhancements, all critical. But what are we doing about the living embodiment, the 2 million people, the 32,000 in New York State? What are we doing about them?
Right.
Because to me, the main driver of mass incarceration, other than the things that are just kind of the macro, you know, the war on drugs, tough on crime, racism, all of that, what is driving it is the massive sentences that are unknown to any other Western nation.
Right.
I mean, you know, this is public defenders. 25 to life like that, 50 to life. I mean, it's 7,500 people serving life or long-term sentences in New York State. So that's criminal.
I think that's so important too, because a lot of people have been introduced to mass incarceration through the new Jim Crow and through these more modern, recent conversations about crime, nonviolent crime, things like that. And I feel like what the harm about that is, I think it has arrived people at a misconception. And I think your average person, I was talking to my fiance about this the other day, and I was like, what do you think are the majority of people who are incarcerated for? Yeah. Drugs or violent crimes? And she said drugs. And I think your average person is going to have that same response. Because I think that's the rhetoric, that's what people hear when lawyers are having conversations about, you know, mass incarceration and decarcerating. But I think it's important for us to combat that misconception and to tell people, no, the majority of people maybe for federal crimes are there for drug-related crimes, but federal crimes are a small fraction of people who are serving sentences throughout the entire nation. And the majority of people who are incarcerated across the entire United States are there for violent crimes, not for drug-related offenses. And people just don't know that.
They don't know that, and a lot of people are afraid to confront it.
Yeah.
Right.
The advocacy community.
Yeah.
You know, New York State, to your point, I'll give you some numbers because we deal with this all the time. 9% of the 32,000 in New York State are in there. This is according to the Department of Corrections for drug offenses. Only 9%.
Wow.
9%.
So to your point, yeah, most of the people in there, they're in there for serious violent crime. And I get very frustrated with my friends and colleagues who immediately, whenever you talk about violent crime, they say, well, but we classify things violent that aren't really violent. I say, okay, stop.
Yeah,
True. A murder is violent. You're not going to persuade anybody with that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are people doing ridiculous time for burglary of an off. But yes, it's not violent. It's classified that way just so people can be punished. I get that. But can we really talk about, of those 7,500 people that I'm talking about, the overwhelming majority were convicted of homicide. That's a fact.
Yeah.
And we either have to confront that and say, but does that mean someone has forfeited the right to ever walk free or not? That's the conversation. And it's such a hard one to have. Even doing the clemency work, we call our project the Second Look Project Beyond Guilt. And we do that. We're trying to distinguish ourselves from the Innocence Project. We're trying to say, and that for us, it's about the massive sentences and redemption and hope and change. Yet I can't tell you how often people will listen and they'll go, yeah, well, you guys got to look into this one guy because he was convicted, but it turns out the DNA said it was someone else. I said, okay, that's not what, because here's what I know. When I get letters from people saying I'm innocent, and there are never enough Innocence Projects, but that's where I send the letter. I forward it to my friends in the Innocence Project. When someone writes to me and they say the lawyer was ineffective, or they didn't call my alibi witness, or the judge's jury charge was defective, I send them to one of the appellate offices.
Mm-hmm.
When someone says, hey, I got 50 to life when I was 18, I was living a crazy lifestyle, this is what happened, there's no way to refer people. There is no organization that is exclusively devoted to this type of work, resentencing, clemency. And I think it's because so many of it, you're not going to be able to say it's an innocent person.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm very happy we had Anthony on the episode, because before Anthony, we had two other guests.
Yeah.
We had Bruce.
Brian.
We had Jeffrey, who both were wrongfully convicted.
Yeah.
And I think any real honest conversation about ending mass incarceration must be with people who weren't wrongfully convicted.
Right, who have committed the crime.
Who have committed harm. And that's where our combos need to be redirected to.
And I mean, I think a lot of people will say, like, well, these long sentences are needed, one, for purposes of punishment, and also, like, for the people who believe in rehabilitation, they may believe that, it's going to take 30, 40 years for this person to actually change, which is, just looking at some of your prior work and your past interviews is not true, right? Like places like Norway, they have a maximum sentence of 20 years.
Correct.
And people are released after 20 years, except in exceptional circumstances.
Exactly.
There are countries that have maximum 20 years, and we have many minimum 20-year sentences here.
Exactly.
Minimum, right.
I think there are 9,000 people, if I remember, who are serving a minimum of 20 years. I looked at it once because that 20-year figure, I thought it was so ironic in New York.
Yeah.
Right. Advocating for a 20-year maximum. I want to know how many people in New York State prison are doing 20 years at a minimum. And it's thousands and thousands.
Right.
And trying to get that change, trying to, we can show the data, we can show numbers, people. I know it's kind of a clip, age out of crime. We know that. It's not about public safety. It's for some people. And I say appreciate it. This is probably the wrong word. But when someone says to me, you know what, you took a life. I don't care that I don't care. I just think you forfeited your right. We learned when we were doing clemency applications, when we try and get the prosecutor's support, we try and get both the trial prosecutor, if it was a trial, as well as the current elected DA of that county. We try and get the judge's support. That's like, the odds of that are like winning the lottery. It's so disturbing. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. We've had prosecutors say, when students have called up and said, can we have a conversation about who our clients become after 30 years? We want to hand you our clemency. I have no interest. You just think you have no interest at all. He took a life. Look what he did. He destroyed that family. And what we learned, and I don't know, I think this is sort of at the crux of it. the students in particular, they want to highlight in our clemency applications, and we do videos of every client. And inevitably, the people who are in for 20, 30, 40 years will say things like, I've missed every graduation.
Yeah.
I haven't been able to walk my daughter down the aisle. Yeah. My parents passed. And it tugs at your heartstring, except when you show it to the prosecutors or the judges who say, well, you think, what about the victim? That victim's mother, your client, they can still go visit your client. The victim didn't get to go to anybody's graduation, didn't get to go to, and I understand it. And the reason I say that is so it makes us better advocates, both for the individual, but also to kind of change hearts and minds, to recognize that, because you can't dismiss that.
Yeah.
It's like, I hear you, and it's, how do we get to a place where that doesn't get in the way of recognizing someone else's humanity and redemption and change?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a struggle.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in my mind, it just takes me back to the age-old adage, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind.
There you go.
Right? I think you can,
Yep.
you can sit with the fact and give the space to the fact that, somebody who was convicted of murder did take someone's life away. And, you can have discussions about that. But, is it really right for you to then say, well, we have to take this person's life away too, and that's right. The only thing that's going to make it right?
Exactly. We have to lock you in a cage for indefinitely. And it also, again, it gets back to what we were talking about before. I mean, where is the role? My restorative justice practitioner friends would say, hey, this is where, can we build this in somehow?
Mm-hmm.
Because how many people, if approached with compassion and thought, would say, I don't want that person to die in prison? I'm sure a lot.
Yeah.
Right? And the people who do this work say, oh, plenty of people would rather have some form of healing rather than saying, lock that person up and let him die in prison. Yet we don't offer it.
Mm.
We haven't gotten to a place yet where we think that's the appropriate thing to do. Instead, there are barriers to it. You're in prison, you can't reach out to the victim's family, anybody.
Yeah.
We're afraid to do it on their behalf because we don't want to get them in trouble.
Right.
So it's what's the word I'm looking for? Anti-restorative is what I would say the system is.
Yeah. Can you share the Cliff Notes procedure of clemency, and then explain what it means for someone to be granted clemency? Does that mean they're automatically released? Can you just give us a bit of the procedure?
Yeah, sure. Here's the wonderful thing about clemency is there's no template. Okay, it's not emotion. There's no. That's why you try and be as creative and compelling as you can. So typically, what do we know the governor's people are looking for? They want to see the person's institutional record. Are there any tickets? Have they done all mandatory programming? Do they have any letters of support from staff? And you try and assemble this. You try and get letters of support from peers, people inside, people who've come home. You try and establish a reentry plan to show that, look, this person has a solid place to live, support system, there's nothing to worry about. There's the crucial personal statement that they want to hear from the person in their own words. So we both have, and that takes months and months.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how many people we've worked with have said, you have no idea how hard this has been. For the longest time, I put up sort of a wall. I didn't want to think about what happened. But it's expected. Most people will tell us at the end that it was incredibly helpful and cathartic no matter what happens, whether clemency is granted or not, to kind of really kind of think about what were the confluence of factors that led to that moment. How do I feel about it now? How do I really express my accountability and remorse? So the personal statement matters. We do sort of an executive summary to try and get our arms around all this material. And I should mention too, even though innocence is not at the heart of it, obviously, when we represent someone who's saying, I didn't do it, we try and, the governor's people says to us, we don't have the capacity. We're not going to reinvestigate. That's for the courts.
Mm-hmm.
But still, if we think we can do a 3-page claim of innocence, literally, we fire that preemptive strike. We say, look, we know you're not going to relitigate. We're not asking you. We just want you to recognize that this is another thumb on the scale because look at this evidence of innocence. coupled with all that the person has achieved while inside.
Right.
If we think somebody was very young when they got a massive sentence, we talk about all the Supreme Court cases around brain development and the neuroscience and all the Roper, Miller, Montgomery, those sorts of cases. If it was felony murder, we cite all the cases around felony murder. If someone is elderly, if they're ill. So this is kind of, again, it's not hardly cookie cutter.
Right.
You know, it's what else can we bring in? And then it goes to the governor's office. And this is the hardest thing on the family. There's no timetable.
And like once it gets to the governor's office, is there further advocacy to like ask the governor, have you read the application? Sure. Who's reading the application in the governor's office?
Here's what we learned. New York State has something called the Executive Clemency Bureau, the ECB. And that's where you're told, and you can find it in the governor's website. So people are told, send your application there. What we learned over time is that's part of the Department of Corrections. That's really where they just, I guess what's the best way to put it? They just make sure that it's noted somewhere. It's like sort of record keeping. Mm-hmm. But that's not where the decisions are made. The decisions are made in the governor's counsel's office. So going back to Judy Clark, it was important to have conversations with the governor's counsel, the governor's lawyer. And so then there's a team of lawyers who work in counsel's office. Mm-hmm. Those are the ones doing the heavy reviewing and vetting. And I can tell you in New York, that process is for real. Those folks, I believe, the people doing the vetting and the reviewing, I think they care greatly about this. I think if they had their way, there'd be a hell of a lot more clemency grants. They do the review. They will ask you for details you can't believe. Wow. We see here there's a misdemeanor conviction from 1987. Can you tell me what that's about? And at first I used to bristle. It's like, why are you asking me something from almost 4 decades ago? And I began to learn they want to make sure they've crossed every T when they get asked by the people above them. Well, was that about domestic violence? Was anybody injured? Were there any weapons? So the vetting, it takes us almost a year to put together a clemency application. Mm-hmm. Students get assigned in January, we file in November. And we supplement and we supplement and we supplement. You know, you mentioned Bruce Bryan before. We filed his application, let's see if I get the years right. I think it was in 2019. He got clemency, I believe, in 22.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Yeah.
Took 3, and we must have supplemented it 15 times. More letters of support, more certificates of program completion, more commendable behavior reports. You learn, it's sort of like you're both as public defenders, right? You feel like every now and then you learn there's a new police report you never heard of.
Yeah.
Like, whoa, where'd that come from? We get that all the time.
Yes.
What's a commendable behavior report? I don't never heard of it. Okay, we have to find out if our client has those.
Right.
You know, case plans. They do case plans. Who knew about that? Let's get our hands on that. So it's a lot of work. It gets in, it hits the governor's office. You get an acknowledgement of receipt. And then it's on us to just keep everybody on the radar screen.
Okay.
Every month or so. Hey, if you guys are interested in looking at young people who are serving massive sentences, here are 15 people with pending clemency applications. You know, you haven't given clemency to any women. You know, we thought that was an initiative of the governor. Here are 15 women we know who have pending clemency applications. And it's just keep banging the drums. But it is so hard on the family and the people inside. Because people who've gone through the trial process are expecting, when's the date? When are we going to get a decision?
Yeah.
And you know what answer we say?
We don't know.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
No idea.
Are there times where you don't get an answer at all? It's sort of like a pocket veto type thing.
Yeah, it just lingers.
Yeah.
And people who are doing it pro se or their family, they'll write and say, should we refile a new one every year? Say, I can't hurt.
Yeah.
Can't hurt. They're trying now to set up a system where they will notify people in some period of time. Either it remains under review. We want you don't have to file something. If it remains under review, you should supplement it if you have something new, or we're not taking any action at this point in time. You can reapply after a year. That's starting to trickle out so that people aren't in purgatory, but most are.
Oh, yeah. And I wanted to make sure we got to the second part of your question, which is, you know, what happens once the governor grants clemency? Is somebody automatically released, or is there a process after?
Yeah, the what happens is so interesting because when I say we, this is myself with my friends and colleagues in the Clemency Collective. It used to be you got clemency, You're out in 3 weeks. Paperwork. The only person who didn't get that was named Judy Clark. Judy was made parole eligible. So, okay, just stay with me on this. The people who were getting clemency were doing indefinite sentences, 50 to life. And the governor has absolute power. The governor said, okay, how long have you been in? 34 years, 11 months and 7 days. That's your new flat sentence. So you've done it. You don't have to see the parole board. You go out. Judy, because of the high political nature, her sentence was reduced from 75 to life to 34 years, 10 months, or whatever it was at that moment, to life. So she still had to see the parole board.
Wow.
The governor's way of saying, I'm giving you something. Because now at least you have a shot. But I'm not taking the weight entirely. And of course, in Judy's case, the parole board denied her for 2 years. And then she got out with the next board. The next number of clemencies that came after that, in the years that followed, everybody came home within 3 weeks. Flat sentence. And the Clemency Collective, we had a meeting with the governor's people. And we go to those meetings. The people who run it, there's a guy named Greg Mingo who got clemency. Bruce Bryan is part of it. A man named John Adrian Velasquez. I mean, all the folks who got clemency, they are so thoughtful. It's like, we're going to come in, we need to have proposals. So one of the proposals was, look, we don't think the governor's issuing enough. And this is, by the way, we're meeting with the governor's council, governor's counsel's office. They don't go in there and just say, give more clemency, because they feel like, they know that's what we want. I said, we have an idea. If the governor is concerned about taking the weight, just make people parole eligible. Give them the chance. People doing 50 to life, 75 to life think I have no hope. I'm going to die in here. Right. Resentence them. If they've been in 28 years, make it 28 to life so they see the board. And the first person who told me that was a great idea was Judy Clark. Because when I got the phone call from the governor's people, when she got clemency, it literally was like this. It's just emblazoned in my head. They said, okay, we have good news. I don't know if you're going to call it great news, but we have good news. I said, okay, what's that? I said, she's getting clemency. I said, well, that's fantastic. What do you mean?
Right, that's great news.
I said, well, we're making her parole eligible. And my reaction to that was, oh, no, don't do that. The parole board is never going to, don't do that. And when I spoke to Judy about
And at that conversation, had the decision been made? Like, do you think there was still room to convince them to
At the first call, yes.
Okay.
I held out hope because I said, this is where we're leaning. I said, these are the reasons not to do it because it's going to be a Pyrrhic victory. When I spoke to Judy, Judy was like, are you kidding? This will be the happiest day of my life if they make me parole eligible because I thought I was destined to die in here. Yeah, I'm going to have a struggle with the parole board, and in light of that, all the people who were part of the Clemency Collective, when there was this discussion on Zoom about should we be asking the governor if she's afraid of giving time served to make people parole eligible, is that a good idea or a bad idea? And it was unanimous. It's a wonderful idea because it's given people hope that they're going to come home. Would you rather have no clemency or make me parole eligible?
Right.
And Bruce Bryan is someone. You had Bruce in here. Bruce was made parole eligible. Made his first parole board. And by the way, but for Judy Clark, I think it's about 10 or 12 people who were made parole eligible instead of time served. Every other person made their first parole board.
Wow.
So there's some good news behind that.
Yeah.
Even though it's political, right? It's the governor saying, I'm not going to take the full weight.
Yeah.
Right.
It's ultimately the parole board who says, we release them, let them beat up the parole board.
I mean, so I guess speaking of politics and the political, how much does the governor's politics or seeming politics on criminal justice affect your advocacy on clemency, or does it at all?
Yeah, the politics is so big. It's so much a part of it. We try and I'm hoping a story is going to come out any day now about one of our clients, a man named Taden Townsley, who's someone Bruce knows, a wonderful candidate for clemency on every measure. And we are trying to get media coverage to sort of help the governor. We're trying to create an atmosphere where there's already enough news coverage out there that people think this is a good thing. Not just that you won't get beat up, but it's a positive thing. So when I first was working on Judy's case and trying to persuade then Governor Cuomo and his people, I kept speaking to people who are far more media savvy than me. And I'd say, okay, I got to figure out a way to explain to Cuomo how this isn't going to hurt him. Because there's going to be blowback. These were two, and people said, you're going about this all wrong. I said, what do you mean? I said, most politicians, they actually want to know, how's it going to help? And I thought, wow, okay.
Yeah.
It'll help with a certain segment of the population. But the more people come home from Clemency and the more people see the good works that they are doing, that they're doing good, they're doing well, I feel like the blowback that the governors across the country fear, it's really not there. That's the pitch I make to the governor's people all the time. I say, let's look at the 23 people that I know that we worked with who got clemency. And a couple of them were very high profile. Was there any negative press? In one or two cases, because they were high profile, there was a hit piece in the New York Post. That was it. It evaporated in a day. The other cases barely got a blip. Some actually got some positive stories. So I think it's real, but the job is to try and persuade them that they are more worried about it than they need to be.
Yeah. I mean, on that, Donald Trump, towards the end of his first term, he granted clemency to, some pretty high profile rappers who were in, and I believed it helped him politically. I think, when he was running again this time, like there were so many rappers, well-known rappers that would come to Trump rallies and be on stage with him and speak to that aspect. And
sure.
I mean, I feel like it was very politically savvy for him to do.
Indeed. And that can, there have been a couple of people who receive clemency who have the kind of profile that really can be supportive of the governor. And they know that.
Yeah.
They're aware of that. I do want to mention one thing about the electeds. Just kind of bear with me if it's on a tangent. Just cut me off.
Please do. Please share.
Okay. The other piece of it is the elected district attorneys. So with the Second Look Act, every chance I get, I say, this bill is critical, but we could win the battle, lose the war. Because if DAs oppose every Second Look motion and judges are as cowardly as we know them to be, what did we prevail? So as we are advocating for this bill, we also have to start pushing hard on prosecutors and on judges to somehow get the word out that this is real. I mean, and I say that from this perspective. Let me take you back to the resentencing statute. My first thought, after I abandoned it, because I said, well, the sentence was legal, even though it's indefensible, I then had more and more people that we were representing with clemency. And I thought, I'm going to file a 44020, a resentencing motion. I'm going to come up with some argument that it was unlawful, right? We're lawyers. We can come up with something, right? Say 50 to life, Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual. Ineffective assistance of counsel. I have the sentencing transcript. The lawyer didn't do anything. Some of those cases, the lawyer did plenty. Some of them, I know 50 to life is not going to be deemed cruel and unusual. I'm going to keep pushing it.
Right.
But I figured I'm going to file it, and then I'm going to call the district attorney's office and say, don't oppose the motion. I'm like, what do you mean don't oppose it? He said, it's the right thing to do. I want to tell you about this person, how much responsibility they've taken. We have support from, in one case, we have support from the victim's family. Do the right thing. I will file the motion. The judge will adjourn it for a response. Your response will be, we don't oppose. And this is where I have to give credit. There's a long way to go. But in Brooklyn, Eric Gonzalez is one of the few DAs, I believe, who has the willingness to rethink a sentence. To say, if you persuade me that the sentence is no longer appropriate, let's see if I still need an argument that there is some illegality, right? But I'm not going to have a knee-jerk reaction to say no. And if we could have the other counties do this. So I'll give you one example, a case in Manhattan that I'm very familiar with. Wonderful lawyers filed a motion for resentencing. And they argued that the lawyer was ineffective at sentencing. Okay, so therefore it is unlawful. And that's a pretty high bar, unfortunately. You know, as you probably know, lawyers don't have to do much at sentencing. That's a whole other issue, which is mind-boggling to me, especially when people are looking at massive sentences, right?
Mm-hmm.
They persuaded the Manhattan District Attorney to agree. It gets in front of a judge, and the judge says, well, I'm denying the motion. I still think the sentence was legal. I think, wait a second. You have the district attorney's office saying we don't oppose the motion, that this person should get resentenced, and you're going to say, like, somehow, well, I am not persuaded that on the law? It's as if, like, who are we kidding about the law? I say this as lawyers, right?
Yeah.
Again, it's not like making something up out of thin air. So to me, the work that has to be done on the judiciary, on prosecutors, both to support clemency when it's appropriate, to support parole when it's appropriate. I'll go back to Eric Gonzalez again, give him his due. Putting aside the resentencing, one of the few offices, I mean really one of the few. When you reach out to the Brooklyn District Attorney and say, this person's coming up for parole, most DAs, I should back up, as you probably know, when you come up for parole or you come up for clemency, the DAs get contacted. What do you think? And many offices, many district attorneys, they have a standard letter, we oppose. Without any, they don't read anything, it's just we oppose.
Right, no individualized actual look at
None. The Brooklyn District Attorney, they will review the clemency application, they'll review the parole advocacy packet, and on many occasions, will say we support. So to me, if one person can do it, why aren't the rest of them doing it?
Yeah.
So a clemency application, it is such a heavy thumb on the scale if I can get a district attorney to say, we agree. Again, why do I raise this? Because you have in my mind, elected, it gives the governor cover to the extent they want it.
Yeah.
Right? They always issue a press release when someone gets clemency. So you can imagine this one. I'm granting clemency with the support of the elected district attorney of pick your county. Right?
Yeah.
Governor can say, you can't beat me up. They told me to do it. They're the ones who prosecuted him.
Yeah.
But getting that kind of support is, like I said before, it's like winning the lottery. And that's just, that's where we need advocates. Right?
Wow. We are unfortunately getting close to our time. I have 3 more questions, and please feel free to piggyback on any of these questions. My first question is, I was watching one of your videos where you were talking about clemency work, and you were making this point about the connection between gentrification and those who were serving life or long sentences.
Correct.
Can you elaborate or share with us what that connection was that you were making?
Sure. Several years ago, I was asked to come into Greenhaven Correctional Facility, a maximum prison in New York, to talk with a group that called themselves the Juvenile Justice Think Tank. These were men who were all serving, the average sentence was 50 to life. They were all convicted when they were teenagers. They had read the Supreme Court case law on neuroscience and brain development more than anybody I know. And we were in the room, and they said, okay, we want to start this way. We're going to go around the room. And there might have been 100 people in the room. We want to talk about a little bit about each of us. It's going to be fast, where we're from, what our sentence is. And Bed-Stuy, I'm from Bed-Stuy, I'm from Bed-Stuy, I'm from Bed-Stuy. These guys have been in 35 years. I'm from Crown Heights, Crown Heights, Crown Heights. And the through line from there to gentrification was just, it's unmistakable. This was just one little small sample.
Yeah.
Right.
It was just staring you in the face. And I'll give you the related piece of it.
Yeah.
And it does, I think, relates to gentrification. I'm sure you're all familiar with the data, and I'll tell you why I got into this. I hope it answers your question. I know I'm going on a lot, but according to the last census in New York State from 2020, according to the census, 15.5% of New York State is identified by the census as Black or African American. 15.5. According to the New York State Department of Corrections, 50%, not 15, 50% of the people in state prison are identified by the Department of Corrections as Black. Okay. But because of that work with those people who came in when they were young, I foiled how many people were serving life or long-term sentences when the crime of conviction happened when they were teenagers. And I got back 841. I said, okay, what percentage of the 841 people destined to die in prison for a crime of conviction that occurred when they were teenager were identified by the Department of Corrections as Black? It was 2/3.
Wow.
Oof. So to me, again, you are the whole, everyone thinks the whole super predator racist trope, wolf pack, like that's then, it's not then. it's still existing.
Still exists.
And so to me, it gets back to gentrification. You're decimating families. You're decimating communities.
Yeah.
And that's just a microcosm of it. So that's where that comes from.
Got you.
And
I
love that. And
great
you know,
breakdown.
me and a couple of my friends also make the similar argument that it's gentrification too. So I love that.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's hard to miss.
My second to last question is you were saying to us earlier, you know, when we go home with our families to have these conversations about sentencing. I really want to arm those of us who are abolitionists with the rhetoric and just the words to be able to engage with people about clemency and about decarceration and about trying to convince people that mercy is a value that we should be striving towards.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for people who are trying to go and have these conversations with people? How do you approach talking to someone and trying to convince them to move towards this idea of mercy and forgiveness? What are some pointers you have for engaging in that conversation?
What a wonderful question. And I go back to something you said before, that obviously the best people to make the case are the people themselves, the people who've got clemency, the people who've come home, because they're the living embodiment, you know.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do I speak to the extent that I can?
Yeah.
I can't speak with that level of power and authenticity. But you know what it is? And this is going to sound probably like a cliche, but this is where I start. A lot of people they quote, and it's originally from Brian Stevenson or, I'm forgetting her name. Oh, Sister Helen Prejean, I think. And it's been destroyed in many ways. But this is what I'll hear people say. You shouldn't be judged by the worst thing you ever did. Which is not exactly, by the way, the actual original quote. But when I hear that, and I found myself saying it, someone said to me once, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And what do you mean? You shouldn't be judged by the worst thing. If you killed someone, you don't think you should be judged? And I thought to myself, wait a second, there's something wrong with the quote. Mm-hmm. We're going to judge you if you killed somebody. Mm-hmm. So here's what I keep saying. What is missing from that particular version of the quote, 2 words. You shouldn't be judged by the worst thing you ever did in perpetuity. That's the part. Mm. You took a life, there's going to be some degree of judgment. Unfortunately, in this country, we stick you in a cage. But what are we going to say? Oh, no, we don't judge you. That's ridiculous.
Right.
But my point is, a sentence once imposed, and I go back to Judy Clark, and this is how I try. Judy says this. When you read her sentencing transcript, this is, I can almost quote it. The judge says, I have a lot of letters asking me to be lenient, all kinds of community support. But watching you, the way you behaved, the facts of this case, I believe you will forever be a threat and a danger, and I am sentencing you to the absolute maximum of 75 to life. Here's what Judy says. And she put that in her personal statement for her clemency application. While I may well have given the judge reason to believe exactly what he said, in fact, it's not true given who I am. That gets back to the in perpetuity. So my line is, a sentence once imposed does not remain just, necessary, and appropriate in perpetuity. Mm. We're not good at predicting the future, right? We can't predict the weather. We can't predict who's going to win a presidential election. We can't predict the economy. Right. Yet these judges, I've read hundreds of sentencing transcripts. You will forever be a menace. You will forever, and going like, what hubris? Mm-hmm. Who are you? And then you meet the people 30 years later and say, you should meet this person now.
Right.
Does that impact somebody who's still, I hope so.
Yeah.
The capacity to change. We all have the capacity to change. That's all we're talking about.
One thing I love doing as public defenders is like when I'm trying to convince the DA to like offer a certain offer, just ask them, meet my client. Yeah. Give my client 5 minutes of being in a room and talking to my client about their life. And I promise you, your attitude towards them will change.
Proximity.
Exactly.
Proximity. Huh?
Are you familiar with Professor Abby Smith?
We're very good friends.
She was my clinical professor when I was at Georgetown.
Oh, is that right?
And she's who I really credit for getting me interested in criminal defense work and sending me on this path. She was really instrumental in that for me. When I was a third-year law student, And in her clinic, one of the activities she did with us was that she gave us all a note card. And on the note card, she was like, I want you to write on that note card the worst harm or the worst thing you've done in your life. You're not going to share it with nobody. Just write it down. Keep it to yourself. And then she was like, all right, once it's written down, I want you now to imagine, what if that card was flipped over, plastered to your forehead, and you had to wear that everywhere you went for the rest of your life. And that is what you were defined as.
Forever.
And that's what we're fighting. That's what we're combating against. It was really powerful to me, and especially as a young, impressionable law student. I'm like, oh, this is actually really, really persuasive.
Indeed.
All right, so we're at the end of the episode, and we like to end every episode with allowing us to share parting words, giving a closing argument, if you will. If there's anything in addition to what you've already shared, and you can direct that to anybody. It can be to lawyers. It could be to the major community. It can be to anybody. What is some last words of wisdom you would like to leave with anybody who may be engaging and watching this episode? And Conrad, be thinking of yours.
Well, I don't want this to sound like a plug.
It's okay if it is.
Well, but I want people, I hope people take a look at our website because it features people who receive clemency and people who are still striving, hoping for clemency.
Yeah.
So it's secondlookny.org, all one word, secondlookny.org. There's a lot of videos of people who are hoping to come home, who still remain incarcerated. It has a list of many of the people we worked with. It has things folks have written, folks inside, because I think that's that they make the most compelling case. The other thing I would say is this. You know, we think of clemency as an act of mercy. And to me, I hope people can be merciful and extend that measure of grace. But when it comes to people with the power, like a governor, and all the governors have some degree of clemency power, I think we need to stop thinking of it as an act of mercy. I think it needs to be regularized and normalized. And to me, I refer to it as an act of rectification. To rectify the massive sentences unknown to other countries, to rectify the massive racial discrepancies that increase as people get longer sentences. It's a way of redressing mass incarceration and the harms that have been inflicted in New York on the same zip codes, communities of color. So to the extent people hear clemency, I think we should all be merciful. For the people who have the power to grant clemency, I think it's a gubernatorial obligation. Because I started out begging, and it's not about that. This is the right thing to do. You have the power in the state constitution. It's not there to gather dust. So to the extent people get the governor's ear or anybody, that's the pitch I hope they would make.
Thank you. What you got for us, Conrad?
I'm smiling because mine was going to be to the governor as well and governors around the country. But I'll piggyback off Second Look NY. Pay attention to all of the bills in the Communities Not Cages package. It's the Eliminating Mandatory Minimums Act, which would go a long way to help with these issues. Second Look Act and the Earned Time Act as well, which would grant good and merit time to people who can't get it right now. Great package of bills.
Indeed.
But also, to governors around the country, if you're listening, I agree. You should use your power for clemency. It's one of the powers, as we said, that you have that is kind of unchecked. Nobody can check this power. It's one of your absolute powers. And, to incorporate another thing we were talking about today, I feel like governors as well should not see an individual who was convicted of a crime as that crime, right? We shouldn't paint them with that scarlet letter. Governors of different states represent all of the individuals within that state, right? Not just people who are not incarcerated, people who are incarcerated as well. So you have an obligation to their well-being as well. And you should see them as a human being, the same way that you see all the rest of your constituents. You should see them as a potential voter. You should see their families as potential voters. And, if your aim is to do things that you feel are going to help the state and do things that you feel are going to garner the votes for you for future runs, then grant clemency applications, because you'll have a whole host of people who will vote for you. You'll have their families, you'll have their friends, and you'll probably have other incarcerated people too once they get out. So that's my spiel to the governor.
Gotcha. And I guess I would direct mine to your average person who may be on the fence with being on board with, decarceration and clemency and parole. And my message to them would be to ask yourself 2 questions. 1 is why, and 2 is what if. If we ask you that, if we say that someone who has committed murder should be released and you say no, my question to you is, why do you think that's the case? Ask yourself why. Oh, well, because they committed harm. Okay. Well, what if we release someone after 40, 50 years? Are they still that danger that you think they were at that time? Ask yourself why, and ask yourself what if. And hopefully through a sincere interrogation of those questions, I think coming to terms with the idea, okay, maybe someone who has served 40 years, who's 50 years old now, is no longer that threat.
Correct.
And if they're released, you are not at risk of them actually committing harm and perpetuating this fear that you have. Why and what if?
Indeed.
Steve, I want to thank you very much for taking your time. I know you are extremely busy, especially after already sharing with us that this is clemency period. This is a clemency time.
Clemency, indeed.
The fact that you took your time out of your busy schedule to come and meet with us and share your wisdom and share your story, much appreciated. I would love to have you on future episodes to talk more about clemency and more of the weeds of it, and just even much more general things that we are interacting with and dealing with. So
yeah, and I want to thank you for coming here, and I also want to thank you for what you do, because you very clearly have touched the lives of so many great people, and they do great things after you're able to touch their lives. And I think they're the beginning of making the world a better place, what they do. And so you are a part of that as well. So just thank you
for that.
And in jest, I want to say the thing that has frustrated me is, like, now you have got me really interested in clemency work. And I have been talking through lately about, what next steps for me look like. And now I'm just very, very interested in learning more about careers and clemency. So thank you for that as well.
We have much to discuss. Well, thank you both. I appreciate the opportunity.
Of course. All right, y'all. We've come to the end of another episode of the Brothers-in-Law podcast. Thank you for tuning in. I really hope that you watch this episode. And if you have, to also go back and watch the episode about parole. They are somewhat intertwined.
Yeah.
But yeah, we hope that you are learning. We hope that you are engaging. And we hope that you took something from this episode. So thank y'all for tuning in. And please stay tuned. We have many more episodes to come.